Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. So today I wanted to talk about some of the reasons to use Windows instead of Linux. And what prompted me to do this is I have a friend who recently bought a new computer in order to run Linux on it, but he opted to install Windows 11 on it instead. His reasoning was that he had invested in an extensive Windows software library at great cost over the last 20 years. And he just wasn't ready to throw all those apps away. The other factor was that Linux has got a learning curve, and it requires you to be willing to learn new applications in addition to learning the new operating system. So as one example, Microsoft Office may have compatible apps in the open source realms such as LibreOffice, OpenOffice, and WPS Office, but they're just really not the same. The menu items aren't in the same place, and visually it is really not identical. If it were identical, I suppose there would be a software copyright infringement. So Windows software is evolving, and if you stick around, it may experience a lot of improvement over the coming years. So now, one really big downside of Windows has always been having to install apps without the benefit of a package manager to manage dependencies and to avoid conflicts. So this didn't used to be a big deal because you'd get a CD or a DVD and you would install your software off of it. Now that optical devices are becoming less common and most applications are downloaded and installed from the internet, you're having to find a package and install that package from whatever source and basically trust that it is a good installation. So the new winget command line package manager is in Windows 11 and is dramatically new technology for Windows, and it can also be installed in Windows 10. A package manager is something brand new that Microsoft has invented, and package managers up to this time have never existed before. So winget avoids searching for, finding, and downloading Windows installation packages from questionable sources and installing MSIs or .exe installers whose package manifest might be blind to the end user. Winget, like Linux apt, dpackage, RPM, yum, DNF, and pacman. Wait a minute, didn't I say that package managers had never been invented before? Well, maybe they had been a few years ago in Linux, but we're not looking at that because if it's not in Windows, it's obviously not a capability. Anyway, they provide a distribution channel or repository for independent software vendors to distribute their tools and their applications. Microsoft developed winget as a native package manager after the hugely popular third-party Chocolatey package manager, another package manager that wasn't a package manager, that many Windows users had used previously, and Microsoft wanted to finally get in on the game. So, Windows File Explorer is the single embedded files browser in Windows, and it does the basics for file management. Linux choices can be daunting, and the file manager choices of things like Nautilus, Dolphin, Crusader, Nemo, Thunar, Conqueror, PCman FM, XFE, and others can be overwhelming to the new Linux user. So in Windows, you wouldn't have to make that choice because you would have one file manager and it might make things easier. Windows Desktop Manager, otherwise known as DWM, enables and renders the graphical user interface in Windows. Linux separates window management into a window manager and also a desktop environment. You usually just hear about the desktop being either KDE, GNOME, XFCE, LXDE, or Cinnamon in Linux, which are the most common. But you have choices. So Linux window managers are divided amongst window managers that are tiling and window managers that are windowed, and they deal mostly with the placement, sizing, and appearance of the actual windows. The Linux desktop environment is a collection of software and tools that control the themes, menu bar, taskbar, icons, application launcher, and startup menu. The most important takeaway here is that in Windows, the desktop environment is mostly fixed with limited customizations, and I might point out that you can get some third-party programs that do some pretty nice customizations in Windows, but you still can't change the fundamental look and feel of Windows because Microsoft wants you to have a consistent feel. So in Linux, you can mix and match the menu types, the taskbars, otherwise known as panels, the application launchers, and also the menus. Linux allows any combination of elements to customize the system and to make it your own. Visually, the Linux desktop can be changed to suit the end user. So Windows Login uses a single built-in process in order to handle authentication and login. In Linux, the display manager is responsible for managing your user authentication and controlling your user sessions. In Linux, you have a choice of display managers such as LightDM, GDM, KDM, SDDM, LXDM, and others. Any Linux distro can also be configured to use any of these display managers. So Linux has lots of choices. Particular Linux distros provide defaults for the file manager, window manager, desktop environment, and display manager. You don't need to distro hop because you can customize any Linux distro to your liking by mixing and matching the components that we've just mentioned. So Windows installs to the hardware and Linux installs to the hard drive, and it configures upon boot up. That feature is a very valuable feature because it allows you to pick up a hard drive that has Linux installed on it on one machine and move it to a completely different machine and still have it work properly, barring perhaps mounting particular drives that might be different on the different hardware, and maybe a video card. So Windows has device drivers for every device. Everything in Linux, on the other hand, is a file, so every device can be accessed without a driver. Exceptions, as I mentioned earlier, might be the video card and perhaps even some network adapters. But when it comes down to it, really, everything in Linux that is configured, if you look at it carefully, you'll find out it's just a file on the file system. So Windows hides internals in DLLs and in a very complex database called the registry. Linux installations mostly just place the files for an app in the folders for that app where it is installed. Windows creates drive letters for every disk and partition that you have mounted, C, D, E, and so on down the line. Linux has one file system, which is the root, and it's depicted by the /. So if you're curious why they use the /, it's because Windows uses the \, and the \/ is pointing backwards in terms of being a backwards thinking operating system, whereas Linux has the / because it's a forward thinking operating system. So the Linux file system is expanded by mounting disks into folders, and the users move into the folder mount point to access other disks or partitions. And we've talked about that on the channel before when we've talked about mounting different devices. In my most recent videos where we talked about mounting virtual devices in Linux, we created a folder. That folder is called a mount point, and we mounted our virtual disk into that folder. So really, a Linux file system can be expanded either horizontally or vertically as far as you want, according to where you place the mount points and mount your devices. So then you have the concept of a kernel. The Linux kernel is the core interface between the computer hardware and the programs that the user is running. The kernel does memory management, process management, hardware interfacing, system calls, and security. The kernel is invisible to the user because the user experience comes from the Linux OS distro itself and all the components that we talked about earlier. The Windows kernel is loaded after the bootloader and is the bridge between user processes in the hardware, so it's really much the same. The Windows kernel is a proprietary black box with no access to the source code. The Linux kernel is open source and you can see all of the source code and you know exactly how it's built. And if there's a problem with the Linux kernel, it's normally fixed by the open source community pretty quickly. If there's a problem in the Windows kernel, it's usually acknowledged, but it can be weeks, days, months, years, decades before it actually gets fixed, if ever. So the Windows kernel includes a GUI stack inside the kernel, whereas the Linux GUI elements are all in the user space. Windows kernel can offer multi-user and multi-session support dependent on the version of Windows and the licensing that you have for your particular version of Windows. The Linux kernel is always 100% multi-user and also multi-session. Windows handles device types differently according to device classes and stores configurations in the registry defining the various different types of devices on the system. Linux handles all devices the same, and all configurations are just simply files and not device drivers per se. So, who should use Windows? Well, most applications have become web-based. And so if you have a specific application that you like in Windows and you appreciate in Windows, Microsoft Office being an example, then you should definitely stay in Windows. If you want to buy a computer off the shelf and plan to run the same OS for its lifetime, Windows is the easiest because it is pre-installed. Now there are a lot of Linux machines out there that you can get pre-installed with Linux. An example is that Dell has some systems that you can pre-order with Ubuntu on them, and System 76 is a company that also sells its systems preloaded with their Linux, and there are several other examples. But in general, most people buy a computer off the shelf, they assume the operating system is on it, and they run that same operating system for its lifetime without a plan to upgrade it. And in that sense, Windows is definitely the easiest option. So if you don't have the time or inclination to learn anything new, definitely stick with Windows. And one of the sayings is, better the devil you know. Well, the learning curve for Windows is pretty consistent even between different versions of Windows. So not having to invest additional time to learn an operating system is a real solid perk. And so you should stick with Windows if you really don't want to learn anything new. So if you don't care at all about privacy and you just want to use your computer, stick with Windows because Microsoft has your best interest in mind. Yes, they do harvest a lot of personal information, but there's a solid justification for this. They harvest that personal information in order to determine what type of marketing they need to do to you, and they also need to determine whether or not they should be doing anything additional, and having your personal information is extremely helpful to them. And you can turn off a lot of those privacy infringing features in Windows, but there's several of them that you cannot. So again, if you don't care about privacy, certainly continue to run Windows. So if an occasional lockup or blue screen is not an issue, then Windows provides all the stability you need. And Windows is generally fairly stable, but you will have lockups of applications and occasional blue screens. And like I said, again, you just expect those from computers, and so those should be acceptable. So if a new version of Windows requires a wipe and reload, or requires you to replace your computer, say in the example of Windows 11 with very stringent hardware requirements and memory requirements, and that's not an issue for you, then Windows is a good solution. And in fact, a lot of Windows users, when they want to run the newer version of Windows, they simply go out and buy a newer computer. And I really can't fault that, because if you don't want to go through the minutia of either trying to upgrade or install an operating system, then Windows is definitely a good choice for you. So if you image your Windows configuration in the event of an update or a virus crashes your system, then you're not going to lose anything. So if you use something like a Kronos True Image and you have a good image copy backup of your system, and Windows hoses something up either through an update or you get a virus that can't be cleaned, then you can always restore your backup. And since just about every user out there in Windows does image backups, this probably won't be a problem either. So who should use Linux? Well, if you have time and patience to deal with a learning curve, then Linux might be a good choice. So there's a lot of really friendly Linux systems out there, and I always talk about Ubuntu on the channel simply because Ubuntu has a very large user community, and it's easy to find solutions for it, and it's somewhat familiar to a lot of Windows users in some ways. Then really Linux might not be a bad choice for you to get used to as your first Linux. But Linux is not what it was 20 years ago, when everything was command line and really there weren't a lot of choices and things weren't running very with much stability, and using different hardware was a problem. Nowadays, there's support for just about everything. So if you like increased privacy and also full control over your operating system and which updates you take and when you take updates, Linux is a better choice. But after all, privacy is not really an issue, because you should be willing to give your personal information out to anybody that wants it, especially a large company, because they always have your best interest in mind. So if you don't mind trying out open source applications and learning a new interface and commands, then Linux is a good choice. So you're not talking about one or two word processors. You might find 8 or 9 word processors out there. And if you're willing to go through all of them and test them out and see which one works best for you, then Linux is probably a good choice. And also, if you like the idea of having a huge user community that you can reach out to for help and the answers to questions, then Linux might be there for you. So my experience in supporting Windows for as long as Windows has been around is that there's good support for Windows out there, but you're really bounded by what you know about the operating system. And since it's closed source software, you can't find a lot of solutions for things that you can't see inside of a black box. So if you rather use your system most of the time instead of fixing broken software, Linux is also a good choice. However, I can tell you from experience and from a professional point of view that it's very important to learn Windows, at least at the desktop, if not Windows Server to some degree, because the world runs on Windows. And it's very important to learn Linux, because Linux basically runs most of the server world, and having a Linux knowledge is also extremely valuable. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't know Windows, and I'm not saying you shouldn't run Windows, but there is considerations that I've mentioned here. So in summary, Windows works. It's always worked. Well, mostly. And we should demand a better user experience from Microsoft. But that's unlikely because Microsoft derives most of their revenue from what's called software as a service, or SaaS, in the cloud, which is paid for by a subscription model, and therefore it's highly profitable. Microsoft has no initiative to make Windows better, and despite new visual appearances in each version, much of the underlying code is 20 to 30 years old, and it works very well with applications that are 20 to 30 years old as well. And it goes back to the discussion about, do you want new Coke or classic Coke? Well, it's also, do you want new code or classic code? And it's very enduring to go back to classic code. So if you need a better user experience, do consider running Linux. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and we'll see you next time.